Hi, this is Jake Jacobs returning again for session 1 of the Real-Time Strategic Change Practicum. Real work with real results in real time. Session 1, hitting the ground running with your RTSC Practicum project. Again, the Practicum purpose to be able to create fast and lasting results with all of your work. Session 1 purpose, to move further faster in hitting the ground running in your Practicum and with your project. The session 1 agenda will begin it with looking at questions from the overview video on the practicum purpose, outcomes, experience, and critical success factors, as well as what we cover in this pre-video for session 1 around purpose, outcomes, getting clear on the work, and then the beginning of the casework. Getting clear on the work, these are the same 4 questions we'll be addressing each time we get together for these pre-videos and for the webinars. So why is it important to do this work today? Well, one is that real-time strategic change, it happens here, it happens now. So being able to hit the ground running with your practicum project is essential to the core elements of RTSC. We also want to do the practicum work in ways that are congruent with RTSC and the principles. And then finally, we begin building community. The sooner we begin building it, the sooner we learn together and we benefit together. What is this work? This work in the session 1 is really about getting insight, and it's getting insight by beginning to look through the lens of what I call the mantras or beliefs of RTSC and the principles. How will we know we've done the work well today and in the webinar? Well, one is you'll have early ideas that you'll begin to start being able to play with, implement. We say that there are short learning loops in real-time strategic change. Have an idea of what the future can look like, reach out, grab it, apply it today, here, now, test it, see what we can learn, and then apply an improved version tomorrow. Deeper understanding of those mantras and principles, and then also getting some ideas about applying these mantras and principles to your practicum project. How are we going to do it? Well, first, insights from these mantras or beliefs, and second, applying these principles and seeing the detailed artifacts and implementation of them as part of a live project. Session 1, the outcomes on the know, do, and be schedule. First, understand the mantras and mindsets. Second, what are the definitions of each of these 6 principles? And third, how do those principles and mantras guide decision and action? So every decision and action that you make, you can rely on these mantras and the principles to make wise ones. Session 1 outcomes. 1, be excited. Be excited about what you can see as potential for your practicum and your project. And the second is confident, so that you can see the value that you're going to gain from the practicum and the value and investment that you're going to put into the practicum. Do outcomes. 1, that you'll begin translating the mantras to your specific work along with the principles. And second, you find ways to leverage what you're learning between now and session 2. The case, again, to review from the overview, it's a large apparel retailer with accelerated growth in Europe, some issues in terms of new roles and relationships that need to be clarified and then also implemented. What were the outcomes? Some basic ones. 1, there was more funding from corporate. Collaborative relationships were worked through and established. And then there was success on the things that really mattered, the new store openings throughout Europe. The mantra insight that we're going to use for session 1 is start anywhere, be willing to go everywhere. So the work with this project, although it turned into a multi-month organization-wide effort, began with a sales meeting to introduce what they call the Grow Fast strategy. There were only 150 people in this meeting. They had issues around accountability and support. The CEO was very focused on accountability, and what we understand from polarities and the key tensions that they help manage and leverage is that support was just as important. Brief story of having the CEO talk to me again and again about how important accountability was, and I was able to say from a polarity standpoint, well, what kind of support is there? If we can provide support for these people, they will be able to fulfill their accountabilities. And then finally, a very well-defined purpose and outcomes for this session. Now, the areas of work, you'll note as we go through the story today and as we go through it on the webinar, that each of these areas of scoping possibilities, developing and aligning leadership, and creating organization-wide congruence, each of them was addressed in just this one beginning of the project. And sessions 2, 3, and 4 will be picking up in more detail on each of these areas of work. Principles of real-time strategic change. So, making reality a key driver is about knowing the inside. So, culture, process, structure, strategy in terms of the inside of your organization, and being smart about the outside. So, what's happening in industry trends? How are you positioned in the marketplace? What new technologies may be emerging? All of these things, the talent pool, are about what's happening outside your organization. And then informed decisions and actions are the result of leveraging this inside and outside the organization realities. More commitment and better answers is around engaging and including. So one of the reasons people normally talk about engaging and including people is, well, we'll get buy-in. And from an RTSC standpoint, we don't have buy-in. If you have buy-in, you have sellers. If you have sellers, you have buyers. So we're not about selling change to people, but informing them so that they can make wise decisions. Providing direction and inviting participation is the way we do that. So that sometimes the most engaging thing you can do is to provide direction, and being smart about when that happens and when participation is involved is a key to real-time strategic change. Preferred futuring. So seeing your best future, and that one is a combination of the best of your past and present and compelling future possibilities. So you'll note in the case study as we go through it, they're very smart about picking up on what's worked from the past and what needs to be brought into the future, as well as what the new and better ways of working need to be. Combine those and you end up with your best future. Creating community. Here is a story of M. Scott Peck. In and through community lies the salvation of the world. The healthiest communities, the most functional communities, are ones in which the organization is achieving its full potential and people within the organization are achieving their full potential. So that is a part and whole polarity. Paying attention to both will get you peak performance overall. Thinking and acting in real time, the most unique of the principles, talks about plan for your future and be in your future now. So many organizations pay attention to planning, and some do a very good job of that. Few are the number, though, that are able to, as I say, be in your future now. Get some image of what the future is, any image at all, and begin living that today. And based on living it today, be smarter, learn, make course corrections, and live even more of that clearer version of the vision immediately. And finally, build understanding. And building understanding is about continuing to learn and develop. The more understanding we have, the more development we can do, and the more we can learn from each other. This is a combination of leveraging, inquiring about what others believe, and advocating for what you believe. The more I take a stand for what it is that I think is right, and the more that you can take a stand for what you think is right, and we can be curious about each other's points of view, the more we can learn together and actually become a learning organization. The unique contribution. So this is a picture of Stan Davis. He wrote a book in 1987 called Future Perfect. Tom Peters endorsed it as a book of the decade. What Davis talked about was managing in what he called the future perfect tense of the verb, the subjunctive. And what that means is as if it had already happened. So when we talk about real time and we talk about thinking and acting as if the future were today, this comes from Stan Davis's work around perfect, future perfect, and a new way of thinking about leading and managing. Learning from the case. What we're going to do then in the webinar itself is go over the principles and then have you apply them to the case. Now the case in this first getting and hitting the ground running is really about one meeting, a sales meeting, 150 people. The thing I want to point out here in the yellow, this is an original project plan starting on June 4th and the event being held at the end of June. So initial timeline was sent. Purpose and outcomes was something that was discussed very early on, 4 days after we started, with the first cut of those going on the 7th. And then on the 8th, the purpose and outcomes and the communication was sent. And what we say, we want to generate excitement, but we also want to generate meaning. And that's where the purpose and outcomes are so critical to all RTSC work. Again, we can spend more time on the webinar here, but you can see that in the 2 weeks between the 9th and the 23rd, there was a high-level design delivered on the 9th, and by the 22nd, handouts, PowerPoints produced, the final corrections and approval to the design signed off on. So things move very rapidly across this organization as a precursor to their entire real-time strategic change event. The buyers meeting, which was the piece of work that we started with, was completed on the 26th. So again, 23 days from start to finish of saying, maybe we should have an engagement here to let's conclude the meeting and move forward. Now, the pre-video focuses on the meeting. The webinar itself will capture the meeting, but then also all of the work that followed immediately from it. There was a buyer's prep meeting on June 17th, so a little more than a week before the session. We were talking about the importance of getting everybody together and the meeting being on Friday, and change starts immediately after that. So this core concept of RTSC, of change happening immediately, was something that was discussed with leaders within the buyer's organization before the meeting. What we want to know more about. This was something that was a collaborative process of coming up with the design. We didn't have a specific microcosm of the entire organization designing this. It was on such a short runway. But what we did do is we got input and shopped it around to get input on the agenda from all different people within the buying organization. They also helped specifically on questions for a panel, and you'll see where that panel shows up in the actual design. The large group sales meeting. So here we see some of that RTSC preferred futuring principle, build on what we've begun and accelerate our progress. And then in terms of the outcomes, again, in a know, be, and do framework, and we can spend more time on this in the webinar, but understanding the strategy, again, building understanding through inquiry and advocacy, thinking in new ways with the realistic assessment of scope and scale of what's ahead. Again, reality is a key driver, knowing what's happening inside and outside our organization. And then finally, the do, gain traction so we can move faster in creating our collective future. Here, we're looking at the real-time principle about what's an idea to accelerate progress and what are we going to do to advance the effort. As we start into the agenda, there's a piece about community and the individual and collective. So not only is what my introduction about who I am, but how are we going to work together? Common in a lot of meetings, this was done in table groups of 8 in a meeting of 150. Then we see the strategy presentation, implementation specifics, and implementation experiences and ideas. So this was a part of the agenda where we talked about, even before it was formally announced and introduced to the buying organization, people had started to have ideas with this panel of representatives about new and better ways of doing business. You see in the table discussions, which is very common in these large group RTSC events, a table discussion to build understanding at that level about what did we hear and questions that we have, and then a Q&A with a panel up front with people who had the experiences of beginning to do business in new ways. After lunch, you see that they did work in role groups. So here we have different groups in different configurations for different purposes. And in the role groups, they started to look very specifically and concretely at important changes that needed to be made and what do we need to keep doing. Again, think of that preferred futuring of the best of our past and present and compelling possibilities for our future. And also a fun question, what could we do to really screw up the implementation? People had a lot of very creative ways that they could make sure that implementation failed. There was a post and vote. So here you can see that we have a number of items where people are able to get their voices heard. And again, individually with the voting and during a break having those votes tabulated. You may be familiar with this, as well as the concept of the max mix groups or the maximum mix microcosms, which we return to after this voting. There were reports from the role groups about the work they needed to do, and then organization-wide action planning. So this is something across the entire buying organization, and this work is best done in a cross-section of the organization. And they came up with 2 early high-leverage actions, and that could be done to move faster, and 2 that could stay on track. Again, you notice that the orientation in this meeting is toward preferred futuring, on the past and present, and on the future. And then at the end of the discussion, the leadership team walked around so that they could gather some information and share it with the larger group. Individual reflection and action planning. So this was where accountability came in. 2 actions that people were going to take in the next 30 days, and the leadership team working in what we call a double feature, being able to look at the information that they gathered in their walk around and see what can we commit to take forward and implement, what do we need to review further, and what is it that we're not going to take forward and why. So this is where participation and direction comes in terms of engaging and including. Not every idea being implemented, but good ones being taken forward and others being studied. And then a final review. What do we know and what questions do we still have? A little bit of time set aside so that these recorded questions could be documented and then answered in an FAQ immediately following the session in the coming days. And then a pulse check to close the session. We'll get into more of the specifics around implementation, but what I thought would be helpful is just the pulse check. Now, often these are called smile sheets at the end of a session. Where are people? From an RTSC standpoint, all information is strategic, all information is gathered, all information is something that we make meaning of. So just to point out here in terms of how much clearer people felt, a 6.2 on a 7-point scale. How confident are you that we'll move forward successfully? A 6.3 on a 7-point scale. How much do you feel people were heard and their ideas taken seriously? Again, another 6.2. And that wraps up our session 1 pre-video. We'll pick up on questions that you have from this in the overview, as well as getting into more detailed applications of the implementation efforts. And that will be something that we'll take on in session 1, hitting the ground running with your RTSC practicum project.